No, I'm not looking to upgrade crossbows again this year. I'm more than content with this crossbow, and I'm going to do some videos about it down the road. But this is the time of year when friends of Bungie are looking to upgrade. Not all of you, but many of you are looking to upgrade to new crossbows. Last year, you may recall, we were on the quest for a successor to Bungie and ended up with this fine crossbow, the Scorpion Deathstalker 420, Bunjie III. So I thought I would share with you a whole bunch of ideas, different things to look for if you are looking to upgrade to a new crossbow. The first thing that I would look for in a new crossbow, very important to me, is speed. Now, is speed everything? No, there's so much that goes into successful crossbow hunting, but a modern crossbow shooting around 400 feet per second or so, that's what I consider the modern speeds, somewhere in the high 300s, in the low 400s, that sort of range, to me, is a modern speed for a crossbow. 359! Now, of course, there's even newer models of crossbows that shoot 450, 480, or even 500 feet per second or more. Those I consider to be the ultra-modern speeds of crossbows. That's what I call them. If you shoot a 400 grain arrow at 400 feet per second or so, you're around 0.7 slugs, or a little bit more in terms of momentum. I did another video on the value of speed in terms of deer jumping the string. Make sure you check that out. But I've also done a bunch of videos on momentum as well. Very important to us as crossbow hunters. Pay close attention to the arrows that the crossbows you're looking at use, the ones that come with it, the ones that that manufacturer recommends or requires. You might have limitations. Raven, for example, might limit the arrows that you can use with that crossbow safely or still under warranty. Some crossbows these days are going to micro diameter arrows. Now, this is a compound bow arrow. Don't tell anybody I have a compound bow arrow in my house. Ooh, you know, this is a crossbow hunting channel. The micro diameter arrows are more aligned with the thickness, the diameter of these compound bow arrows. And traditionally, your crossbow arrows, your crossbow bolts, if you prefer, are a little bit heavier, right? They're a little thicker in diameter. These are fine if you want the micro diameter arrows. You're going to get better penetration with these because it's easier to push a skinnier arrow through a deer than a thicker arrow. But it's also a little easier to push one of these through a target. So they're a little bit harder to find a target that works for you as well. Just keep that in mind. And while we're on the topic of arrows, the third thing you want to look for is nocks, right? In my opinion, lighted nocks are mandatory. There's absolutely no reason in this day and age, in the modern era of crossbows, to not use a lighted nock. A lighted nock helps you find the arrow after you shoot it. It helps you watch that arrow through the scope and hit the target. It allows you to see from 60 yards away in the 60-yard backyard where that arrow hit the target without getting binoculars out and trying to look. They also help with your video, right? They make the videos look a lot better. It is just a great, great tool, and there are plenty of options on the market for lighted nocks in this day and age. But not all nock styles come in a lighted option. Just be mindful of that. This is Genevieve's crossbow, Bunjie Jr. This crossbow, you have to have a crank to cock it. Now, I've cocked it with a rope once, and I wasn't going to do that again. Not that it's not doable, but if you're going to be shooting in the backyard very often, you're going to want a crank. Not all cranks are created equal. This one originally came with a C2 crank, and that one clicked while you're cocking it. Deer are going to hear that. That's not necessarily a good thing. And also, it was not designed to allow you to decock the crossbow. Some cranks require you to wear extra equipment in order to use the crank. Some cranks are built into the crossbow. That adds a little bit of weight, and you might not be able to maintain the crank on your own. You might have to take it to a shop or something. Those are just things to think about, right? And you decide which crank is for you. Another thing you want to look for when you're talking about cranks and how you cock the crossbow, let's talk about how you decock the crossbow? How do you unload it at the end of an unsuccessful hunt? See if I can fit them in frame here. Now, this is Bunjie, the OB, right? The original Bunjie, my 2010 Excalibur Axiom in pristine condition, despite the fact it killed dozens and dozens and dozens of deer with me and a bear and all kinds of other good stuff. All the adventures we've been on, it feels so good to hold this crossbow, but it's older, slower, and obviously very large. One of the things I like about this crossbow was the ability to decock it, right? At the end of an unsuccessful hunt, which didn't happen all that often, right? At the end of the hunt, you can decock this crossbow very easily by just reversing the process of cocking it with the rope cocker. Not all crossbows allow you to do that, however. With Bunjie III, right, the Scorpion Deathstalker 420, you have to fire a decocking arrow. That's becoming less and less common as we move to cranks. But one of the things I liked about Bunjie III, the Deathstalker, was that I could rope cock it, so I didn't get a crank on that. I don't really like cranks. I'm not there yet. You know what I mean? I understand they're part of modern and ultra-modern crossbows, but I'm putting that off as long as possible. I have to use a decocking arrow, right? This is kind of old school anymore. Just keep in mind, how are you going to decock your crossbow, right? Another thing people want to think about when they're looking at new crossbows is maintenance. Can you change the string and maybe even the cables yourself? That was kind of important to me. I've always been an Excalibur guy, the recurve crossbows, and those are pretty easy if you know what you're doing to change the strings. Not a big deal. Traditionally, in the older era, it was very difficult to change the string and cables on a compound bow. Not necessarily difficult, but you would either have to take it to a shop or buy a bow press. I specifically looked at the Scorpion Deathstalker because it allows me to change the string and cables myself. I've done that already. It's really not that big a deal. Check out the little visitor I've got while I'm putting this video together right outside my window. Now, here's something you probably didn't think about, right? You're looking at a new crossbow. You find the one that you want, and you can't wait to go hunting deer with it. Then you buy it, and how do you carry it? I have never used a sling. The old B here, Bunjie, I just carry this crossbow over my shoulder like this. I carried it through the desert in Arizona, through the woods in northeastern Pennsylvania, Maryland. I've gone to Maine with it, carried it just like this. I can walk for miles and miles and miles just like this. And when the time comes, if I get tired of that, I can switch it over on this shoulder like this and walk like this, and it's not a problem. This crossbow fits me perfect because I'm a pretty big guy, and it's a pretty big crossbow. But, when I moved to Bunjie III, that doesn't work anymore. You see what I'm saying? This is not comfortable. But that's okay. I don't really like having a sling. I've had slings on it, tried that. The problem with a sling, throwing it over my shoulder, the crossbow interferes with the backpack, right? Because this has all this going on. How are you going to carry it? Is it comfortable to carry in and out of the woods? Is a sling going to work for you? How are you going to transport it to and from your hunting locations? And if you're like me and you travel a little bit here and there, can you get a hard case for it? One that you can fly with on an airplane, maybe even, or at least put in the back of the pickup truck. That's not going to matter if it gets wet, that sort of thing. The Excalibur crossbows we have, pretty easy to get Plano cases for them. Love them, nice hard cases. The Scorpion, on the other hand, they really don't make a case for that crossbow. I ended up buying a giant case that took up most of the back of the car. I now have a pickup truck, woohoo! So maybe that'll make a difference. You got to take that into account. What are you going to put this crossbow in to transport it from one place to another? Be thinking of that before you even buy the crossbow. Another thing you want to think about before you go pulling the trigger on a new crossbow is the trigger. See what I did there? How's that for a segue? So anyway, the trigger on this Deathstalker 420 is phenomenal. I love it. It's the perfect trigger. But then again, the trigger on the original Bunjie and the trigger on Bunjie Jr. are the perfect triggers, and I love them. They're all kind of the same to me. It doesn't really make much difference. I will say this, however, there are a lot of different trigger models out there, and there's some experimentation going on with different manufacturers. If you look at the Excalibur models now, some of them are coming all of a sudden with two-stage triggers. That's where you got a little bit of, it free flows back to a certain wall, and then you stop. That's when you pull the trigger, that kind of thing. I've shot a couple of other models back last year when we were on the quest for a successor to Bunjie, and there were some triggers I didn't like. Raven, I didn't like their trigger. A lot of travel in there, and I wasn't sure where it was going to go off. But if I used a Raven all the time. I would be very comfortable with that trigger. It would be familiar to me, and I don't think I would have a problem with it. Do you understand? I think has more to do with what you get comfortable with and used to. All right, I'm bringing the OB back on the camera because we're going to talk about the next thing that I think you should take into account when you buy a new crossbow. Not as important as it used to be, maybe, but nonetheless, be mindful of uncocked width. I don't care about cocked width, and that's all these manufacturers seem to advertise. It seems to be all they care about, because those numbers are smaller and more attractive to crossbow consumers. The uncocked width is really all that matters. It's the distance between the outside of this cam to the outside of this cam, because this and this, those are what's going to hit the tree next to me. That is what's going to damage the crossbow. So that's really all we need to take into account. Camo or black? That's kind of a decision we have to make in this day and age, the modern era of crossbows. Really, it's up to personal preference, but these crossbows get smaller and smaller and smaller, and therefore a big black one, where it used to be a big giant piece of equipment sitting up in a tree stand with you, now they're smaller, they don't take up as much space. The black is fine, it actually doesn't stand out quite as much. Plus, I've noticed some of the camo patterns in this day and age, I don't particularly care for. This one's fine, but some of them almost look white in appearance. In the end, I think it's just personal preference, but you got a couple of options. The number 12 thing you might want to look for in terms of a new crossbow is how loud is it when you shoot it? Now, this one's really quiet by crossbow standards. It's a pretty smooth shooter. And there's plenty of other crossbows out there, the Missions, for example, that are very quiet in comparison to other crossbows. In terms of the perceived loudness, this one's somewhere around 80 decibels. But if you look at a new crossbow, like the Raven R500, reports on the internet are that that thing is really loud. That's like 112 decibels. Really, that's 3 times as loud as this crossbow in terms of perceived loudness. Now, we're not talking firearm volume or anything like that, but the deer are going to react a little differently to a quieter crossbow versus a loud one. One of my most popular videos on Death by Bunjie is how to quiet your crossbow. There's all kinds of little rubber doodads you can put on your crossbow, right, that help quiet it down. I'm not a big fan of those. And if you don't mind the speed reduction that you get by putting those sorts of things on the limbs, then that's fine for you. I don't really like putting stuff on the limbs because it does reduce the overall speed. Something like this, however, you know, this is built into the stirrup and they're on here on the, you know, that's fine. That rubber stuff only goes so far. Really, your choice in what crossbow you go with is going to have a lot more to do with the overall loudness of that crossbow than any amount of rubber that you put on it. The scope that comes on your crossbow. This is an Excalibur scope, the Twilight DLX. They don't make it anymore, but it's really good in low light. And for me and my old eyes, I can see through this thing just great. It only goes out to 60 yards, but so does my backyard. But anyway, that scope, I always felt a little funny putting an Excalibur scope on a Scorpid crossbow, but it works great, so I don't really have any complaints about that. The scope, just like we talked about the triggers, how you get used to a certain trigger and then it's fine, it doesn't really matter, I think, and that's my opinion. I think the scope's the same thing. This is the most personalized item on a crossbow. You put a scope on here, that's what we see when we look through that scope all the time. We see that familiar arrangement of reticles. So I think, to me, the scope's one of the most important things. But keep in mind, Wyvern Creations, maybe some other places, if you check out those sites, you can actually buy a crossbow package sometimes without a scope installed. And then you can put your own scope on it, right? The scope that you like. That way you're not buying a scope that you're not going to use. In fact, my next video will be about the contents of this package, a new scope. I'm trying something out. Even though I love the Twilight DLX from Excalibur, that old scope, I actually own 4 or 5 of those just in case they break, even though they've never broken. I don't know. I do that. I don't know. Right? But anyway, there's a scope in this package, a new design that I'm going to try out, and we'll do a couple of videos on that. So make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. Check out this other video that's floating around on your screen. And until next time, all hail Bunjie.